Imagine stepping into a small plane with a man who seems harmless, even kind. The hum of the engine drowns out your thoughts as you look down at Alaska's endless wilderness. A frozen, empty expanse of trees, rivers, and snow. There's no one for miles, just you and him. But then, the plane lands. The door opens. He pulls out a rifle, looks at you, and tells you to run. That's when it hits you. You're not a passenger. You're prey. And this man, Robert Hansen, is about to hunt you like an animal. This wasn't fiction. This wasn't a nightmare someone dreamed up for a horror film. This was the reality dozens of women faced in the icy grip of Alaska during the 1970s and 80s. Hansen, later known as the Butcher Baker, lived a life so carefully constructed that almost no one suspected him. To his family, he was a devoted husband and father. To his neighbors, a small-town baker who handed out bread with a shy smile. 2 hunters and pilots. Just another man enjoying Alaska's rugged outdoors. But beneath this mask was a predator who turned the wilderness into his private killing ground. Over the course of a decade, Hansen kidnapped women from Anchorage, many of them sex workers or dancers whom society had already pushed to the margins. He would promise them money or lure them into his car at gunpoint. Then, using his personal plane, he deflied them into the remote wilderness land, so isolated that even the bravest would struggle to escape. And once they were there, he unleashed the darkest part of himself. He would let them go, just for a moment. Hive, Temope. Let them run through the woods. And then, like the skilled hunter he had always been, he stalked them, toyed with them, and ended their lives with chilling precision. What makes Hansen's story even more terrifying is how long he got away with it. Women vanished. Families mourned. And yet, time and again, police overlooked him. He was the nice guy, the man who owned a bakery, who blended into the background of Anchorage. No one imagined that inside his freezer were trophies of his crimes, or that he had maps marked with shallow graves scattered across Alaska's vast land. Tonight, we're stepping into one of the most disturbing cases in American history. This is not just a story of murder, but of deception, of a man who managed to live 2 lives at once. One, as a husband, father, and businessman. The other, as a sadistic hunter who found his thrill in terror, pain, and control. And if you think you know the story, stay with us, because the details of Robert Hansen's life, from his abusive childhood to his terrifying hunting grounds, reveal not just the making of a serial killer, but the horrifying truth of how ordinary men can hide the darkest of secrets. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe. These stories are not easy to hear, but they must be told, because every time we uncover the truth about monsters like Hansen, we shine a light on the shadows where they thrive. And the story of the Butcher Baker is one that still echoes through Alaska's frozen forests. To understand the making of Robert Hansen, the man who would one day turn the Alaskan wilderness into his personal hunting ground, we need to go back to where it all began. His childhood, his family, and the shadows that shaped him long before the killings ever started. Because monsters like Hansen aren't born with a rifle in their hands. They are molded, piece by piece, by pain, neglect, and resentment. Robert Christian Hansen was born on February 15, 1939, in Estherville, Iowa. The town was small, conservative, and strict, the kind of place where reputations mattered more than feelings. His father, a Danish immigrant, was known as a cold, domineering man. He ran a bakery in town, and from an early age, Robert was forced to work long hours in the family business. There wasn't much room for warmth in his household. His father demanded obedience, hard work, and silence. Affection was rare, if it ever existed at all. For Robert, childhood was already a battlefield. He suffered from severe acne, the kind that scarred his face permanently, leaving behind pockmarks that made him self-conscious for life. On top of that, he had a stutter, a heavy, stammering block that made every sentence a struggle. In school, children noticed, and children can be cruel. They mocked him, excluded him, and whispered behind his back. While others laughed in playgrounds and went to dances, Robert stood alone, nursing a storm of shame and bitterness. He longed for acceptance, especially from girls, but rejection followed him everywhere. His face, his voice, his awkwardness. They made him invisible at best, a target at worst, and every insult, every humiliation, sank deeper into him. It wasn't just embarrassment. It grew into rage. Rage at the kids who laughed. Rage at the girls who wouldn't look at him. Rage at his father, who demanded perfection but never gave love. While other boys turned to sports or social circles, Robert found his only sense of control in something different. Hunting, out in the woods, there were no bullies, no stares, no judgment. With a bow, a rifle, or a trap, he could become the predator instead of the prey. He developed patience, skill, and precision, learning how to stalk quietly, how to wait, how to kill. Hunting became his escape, his therapy, and his secret world of power. And soon, it would become the foundation for something far darker. By his teenage years, Hansen's resentment had hardened into obsession. He began to nurture fantasies. Violent ones. Fantasies of revenge against the people who ridiculed him. Fantasies of dominating women who had rejected him. In his private mind, he started weaving together the threads of anger, humiliation, and desire into something twisted. And like many killers who would come after him, his inner world began to split. On the outside, he was still the awkward boy working at the bakery. But inside, he was imagining himself as the hunter. Not of deer, not of birds, but of people. Psychologists later said Hansen's childhood was marked by a perfect storm of factors that often breed killers: an abusive, emotionally distant parent, early experiences of bullying and rejection, and a coping mechanism that gave him both control and satisfaction hunting. But at the time, nobody noticed. To his teachers, he was just shy. Toisvater. Just disappointing. To his peers, just forgettable. But Robert Hansen never forgot. Every wound left a scar, not just on his skin, but in his mind. And those scars would one day surface in the cruelest ways imaginable. Because the boy who couldn't speak without stuttering, the boy who was laughed at for his acne, was already beginning to imagine a future where he held the power, and others would suffer. The seeds of the butcher-baker had been planted. All that was left was time for them to grow. By the time Robert Hansen entered his late teens, the quiet boy, who once hid behind a stutter and acne scars, was beginning to reveal a different side of himself. The pressure of his father's cold expectations, the loneliness of being mocked and ignored, and the simmering resentment he carried inside had nowhere safe to go. And so, that anger began to leak out in destructive ways. Hansen's first known crime wasn't murder. It was fire. In 1960, at the age of 21, Robert was arrested for burning down a school bus garage in Pocahontas County, Iowa. On the surface, it seemed like a reckless act of vandalism, but for Hansen, it was something else entirely. Fire gave him a sense of power. In the flames, he could watch destruction unfold by his own hand. Something about that control, that release, filled him in a way nothing else did. But Hansen didn't stop at arson. His resentment toward women, especially those who rejected him, began to find darker expression. While most men would experience heartbreak and eventually move on, Hansen's wounds festered. His humiliation turned into violent fantasies, and soon, those fantasies started to blur with reality. Around this time, he was briefly married. But like many things in his life, the marriage quickly collapsed. His inability to connect emotionally, combined with his controlling behavior, made the relationship short. It reinforced his lifelong belief. Women didn't want him, and the rejection only fueled his obsession with power and control. After his arrest for arson, Hansen spent time in a reformatory and later a psychiatric institution. Doctors noted his immaturity, his stutter, his feelings of inadequacy. Some even flagged that he was manipulative, capable of presenting himself as harmless while hiding his darker impulses. Still, he was released. The system, as it often did with young offenders, assumed he could be rehabilitated. But Hansen was far from cured. If anything, his time in confinement only sharpened his bitterness. Outwardly, he tried to conform, taking jobs, staying quiet, even remarrying. But inside, his fantasies were evolving. He no longer just wanted revenge in his mind. He wanted to act. He began targeting women, not yet with the precision he would later perfect, but with attempts at abduction and assault. Prostitutes and vulnerable women were often his choice, because he believed they were disposable in the eyes of society. If they disappeared or cried out, who would listen? Who would come for them? In Hansen's twisted logic, these women were perfect prey. One failed abduction in the early years almost exposed him, but Hansen learned quickly from his mistakes. He began planning more carefully, thinking more strategically, and hiding his crimes behind the mask of an ordinary man. Each attempt emboldened him, and Aaknermis taught him something about control. This period of Hansen's life is often overlooked, but it was crucial. These weren't just random acts of violence, they were rehearsals. He was testing boundaries, pushing limits, and shaping his method. Every fire he lit, every attempt to dominate or abduct, was a step toward the cold and calculated killer he would one day become. It is also during this time that Hansen's obsession with hunting animals began to merge with his fantasies about women. The skills he had mastered in the wilderness, stalking, trapping, waiting for the perfect shot, began to bleed into his darker desires. He no longer saw women as untouchable. In his fantasies, they became game, prey to be pursued and controlled. By the late 1960s, Hansen had already built the foundation of his double life. To his neighbors, he was the quiet baker, the man with a wife, a job, and a routine. But beneath that surface, his rage and fantasies were growing stronger. And soon, he would discover the perfect environment to bring them to life. The vast, frozen wilderness of Alaska. When Robert Hansen moved to Alaska in the late 1960s, it was like destiny had delivered him the perfect stage for the life he had always fantasized about. The sprawling wilderness, endless forests, and isolated mountains seemed to stretch forever. To most, this was untamed beauty, a chance for adventure and new beginnings. To Hansen, it was opportunity. Anchorage was growing quickly back then. Oil money poured in, new jobs attracted workers, and the city began to pulse with a mix of people chasing their own American dream. Hansen fit right into this new frontier town. He opened a small bakery, known for its fresh bread and friendly service. Customers would see a shy, polite man, with glasses perched on his nose and flour on his hands. He was a husband, a father, a churchgoer, the kind of man you would never look at twice. But that was only half of the story. Behind closed doors, Robert Hansen was a volcano waiting to erupt. His life as a baker was just a mask, carefully constructed to shield the truth. Inside, the old rage still burned, the scars of rejection, the humiliation of being mocked, and the hunger for control never left him. Alaska didn't tame Hansen, it empowered him. The wilderness became his sanctuary. Every chance he got, Hansen would take his rifle and disappear into the endless woods. There, in the silence of the trees, he was no longer the awkward man with a stutter. He was a hunter. The thrill of tracking, waiting, and killing animals gave him a rush nothing else could match. Each hunt reinforced a dangerous belief. That out, he was in complete control, and it wasn't long before that belief began to twist. Hansen started to imagine what it would feel like if the prey wasn't a moose or a bear, but a human being. The wilderness was too vast, too unforgiving, for anyone to ever find out. The fantasy was right there, waiting. Meanwhile, Anchorage itself offered Hansen easy access to potential victims. As the oil boom brought more people to the city, the red light district thrived. Prostitutes, dancers, and young women passing through town for work were everywhere. Many were transient, far from family, and often overlooked by police. In Hansen's mind, they were invisible. If one of them vanished, who would notice? Who would care? By day, Hansen kneaded dough and sold pastries to smiling customers. At night, his mind wandered to darker plans. He began collecting trophies of a different kind, not just antlers or hunting photos, but small pieces of jewelry from the women he met. He studied their movements, learned how to gain their trust, and perfected his role as the quiet, harmless man. This double life gave him confidence. No one suspected the baker. He even joined the community in more ways. Hansen took part in local hunting competitions, earning respect for his marksmanship. On the surface, he was admired for his skills. To the people around him, he was simply a man passionate about the outdoors. In reality, These contests only sharpened his abilities for what he planned to do next. His wife and children had no idea about the storm brewing inside him. To them, Robert was reserved but reliable. He kept his family fed, maintained a steady business, and never caused trouble. Yet every time he slipped into the wilderness alone, he was practicing, testing, planning. This double life is one of the most chilling aspects of Hansen's story. Neighbors trusted him, church members prayed alongside him, and customers laughed with him over the counter. All the while, he was fantasizing about turning the Alaskan wilderness into his personal hunting ground. Soon, the fantasies would no longer be enough. Hansen had built the perfect mask, earned the trust of his community, and identified the victims no one would miss. He was ready to take the next step, ready to merge his two worlds, the baker and the hunter, into something far more terrifying. The killings were about to begin. Robert Hansen's cruelty wasn't impulsive. It wasn't a sudden snap of violence. His murders were designed like a ritual, a carefully crafted hunt that transformed his darkest fantasies into reality. Unlike many killers who struck in moments of rage or panic, Hansen's killings followed a method so cold and calculated that it still chills investigators to this day. It often began in Anchorage's seedy downtown strip. The bars, clubs, and neon-lit motels, where sex workers and exotic dancers worked night after night. Hansen knew this world well. To him, it was a perfect hunting ground. These women were often far from home, vulnerable and unprotected. Many were used to men making promises, buying time, or flashing money. Hansen blended in seamlessly. With his shy demeanor and soft voice, he didn't look like a threat. He looked like just another lonely customer. Once he gained their trust, Hansen would lure them in. Sometimes he offered extra cash. Sometimes he pretended he just wanted company. The women thought they were walking into an easy transaction. Instead, they were walking into a trap. He would overpower them quickly, often at gunpoint. Imagine the terror of realizing that the quiet man you thought was harmless suddenly had a weapon pressed against you. At that moment, Hansen was in control, and he savored it. But this was only the beginning. Unlike most killers, Hansen didn't kill immediately. That would have been too quick, too easy. He wanted the hunt. He wanted the chase. Using his small private plane, a Super Cub Bush aircraft, Hansen would fly his victims into the Alaskan wilderness. To them, the flight may have first seemed like a strange adventure, but soon the reality set in. The endless forests below, the icy rivers, the mountains rising in the distance. There was no escape. When the plane landed on a secluded gravel strip or riverbank, the nightmare began. Hansen would sometimes chain or restrain his victims while preparing. Then, like some twisted game, he'd release them into the wild. Alone, terrified, and freezing in the Alaskan wilderness, they were given what he called a head start. And then Hansen would follow, rifle in hand, patient, deliberate, experienced in the art of hunting. For him, it wasn't just about killing, it was about control, power, and domination. He turned human lives into prey, stalking them through the trees, listening to their screams echo against the silence of the forest. Some women tried to run, some begged, others froze in shock. But out there, miles from help, the outcome was always the same. The wilderness was Hansen's perfect accomplice. Alaska's vastness swallowed the evidence. The snow erased tracks, the rivers carried away traces of blood. He knew the land better than anyone. To the women, it was a maze of death. To Hansen, it was his hunting ground. On Seikilit, Hansen kept souvenirs. Small items of jewelry, necklaces, rings. These were his trophies, proof of his power. Each trinket was a reminder of another hunt, another conquest. He stored them away, hidden like precious metals earned through cruelty. Back in Anchorage, no one suspected a thing. He returned to his bakery, smiled at customers, kissed his wife, and played the role of a normal man. Meanwhile, the bodies of his victims lay buried in shallow graves, marked on secret maps he kept hidden, as though he were cataloging his kills like game animals. The method was terrifying not just for its brutality, but for its precision. Hansen had designed every step to give himself the ultimate thrill, and to make sure no one ever caught him. This was not just murder. It was sport, a game of life and death, played in the frozen silence of Alaska. And as long as Hansen controlled the rules, no one could stop him. By the late 1970s and into the early 1980s, Anchorage had a problem that most people didn't want to talk about. Women were disappearing. At first, no one noticed. After all, Maniofansan's victims were sex workers, dancers, and women on the margins of society. But when bodies started surfacing in the wilderness, half buried in shallow graves, the whispers in the city grew louder. For Hansen, each killing was not just an act of violence. It was a ritual. His hunting method gave him complete power over life and death, but it was the aftermath that revealed just how methodical he really was. He wasn't sloppy. He didn't leave Tracy. He treated his victims the same way he treated animals he had hunted since childhood, trophies to be taken, cataloged, remembered. The women who fell into his trap had no idea what was coming. They thought they were going to make some money, maybe spend an hour or two, and then leave. Instead, they found themselves in handcuffs, or with a gun pressed against their heads, being shoved into his plane. Once in the wilderness, Hansen gave them hope. False hope. He would tell them to run. Can you imagine that? The bitter wind cutting into your skin, your breath turning to frost, your feet slipping on moss and stone, all while knowing that behind you a man with a rifle is stalking your every move. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves, could mean the bullet is coming. Some victims ran until their lungs burned, their legs giving out beneath them. Others hid, trying desperately to blend into the endless trees. But Hansen was a skilled hunter. He had tracked moose and bear in these same forests. Human prey was no different, only more thrilling. Slowly, carefully, he closed in, and when the shot rang out, it wasn't just a kill. It was a moment of triumph for him. The brutality didn't end with the deaths. Hansen often violated his victims before or after killing them, feeding his hunger for dominance. Then, as if finishing a hunt, he would bury their bodies in shallow graves across the Alaskan wilderness. Each burial site was carefully marked on a map he kept hidden, a chilling catalog of his crimes. Later, when police uncovered this map, they were horrified to realize how many red marks dotted the landscape. At least 17 women are confirmed dead at his hands, but investigators believe the number could be much higher. Possibly 30 or more. For each woman, Hansen kept a small token, a piece of jewelry, a necklace, a ring. These trophies were not just souvenirs. They were proof of his power, physical reminders of the nights he turned human beings into prey. He kept them in a hidden stash, locked away as though they were treasures. Meanwhile, Anchorage was quietly gripped by fear. Women whispered about friends who had vanished after a night of work. Families put up missing posters. Police, overwhelmed and skeptical, often dismissed these cases after all. Many of the victims were from vulnerable communities. To them, the disappearances looked like runaways, or women leaving town. Hansen counted on that. It made his hunts easier. But the bodies that were found painted a different story. Hunters and hikers stumbled upon remains in the Matonaska-Susitana Valley, near rivers and gravel pits. And deep in the woods where only someone with intimate knowledge of the land could go. The bodies bore marks of gunshots, restraints, and trauma. These weren't accidents. This was systematic slaughter. Still, Hansen continued living his double life. By day, he was the friendly neighborhood baker, serving bread and pastries to the very community he was terrorizing. He attended church, went hunting with friends, and smiled for family photos. By night, he prowled the streets, selecting his next victim. Each killing reinforced his sense of invincibility. Each successful hunt emboldened him. And with every trophy he tucked away, Hansen built his secret empire of death. But in time, his precision would be matched by fate, and one survivor would shatter his perfect game. By the early 1980s, Anchorage wasn't the quiet frontier town it once was. Oil money had brought people in from everywhere. And with it came crime, nightlife, and shadows where predators could hide. But even in a city already used to violence, something darker seemed to be at work. Women were vanishing at an alarming rate. One week, a dancer would disappear after leaving work late at night. The next, a young woman was last seen climbing into a car. Families put up missing posters, but they were quickly torn down or covered by new ones. It It became a sickening routine. Another face, another name, another life gone. The whispers spread fast through the community of women most at risk. Strippers, sex workers, and dancers began warning each other. Don't go out alone. Some stopped taking jobs from strangers altogether. But for many, the risk was unavoidable. Money was scarce, and Anchorage's streets didn't forgive poverty. For them, survival meant stepping into cars with men they didn't know. And for some, that man would be Robert Hansen. Yet no one suspected him. How could they? Hansen wasn't the shadowy figure people imagined when thinking of a serial killer. He was a family man with a wife and 2 children. He owned a bakery where locals lined up for pastries. He was soft-spoken, polite, and seemed almost timid. Not the kind of man you'd imagine burying bodies in the wilderness. This dual image was Hansen's shield. Even police overlooked him. When women disappeared, investigators often blamed the transient nature of Anchorage's population. Many victims were from marginalized backgrounds, and law enforcement assumed they'd left town, overdosed, or run away. In a cruel twist, their very lifestyles made their vanishings easier to dismiss. Hansen knew this. He counted on it, but the wilderness was beginning to betray him. Hunters and construction workers stumbled across remains in places only experienced outdoorsmen could reach. Shallow graves held bones, bullet casings, and torn clothing. Some women were still bound with rope. The brutality of the killings couldn't be ignored. These weren't accidents or suicides. Anchorage had a serial predator. Fear began to spread, not just among the women at risk, but throughout the city. Parents warned their daughters not to trust strangers. Bars and clubs buzzed with rumors of a killer who hunted women like animals. Still, without hard evidence, the police had little to go on. There was no clear suspect, no solid leads, just bodies in the dirt, piling up like grim warnings. Behind the scenes, the authorities started forming task forces, quietly pooling resources to investigate the disappearances. But the killer seemed untouchable. His knowledge of the wilderness gave him the advantage. The remote valleys and forests were his hunting grounds, and his victims rarely returned. Meanwhile, Hansen lived his life as though nothing was wrong. He attended church services, went on hunting trips with friends, and brought home fresh bread from his bakery. Neighbors described him as ordinary, even kind. No one saw the darkness that burned beneath the surface. The hunter, who gave women a head start, only to gun them down like prey. The contrast was almost too much to believe. On one side of Anchorage, families were grieving lost daughters. On the other, Hansen's children were playing in their backyard, blissfully unaware of the horrors their father was committing after dark. But as the disappearances stacked up, the city's patience thinned. People demanded answers. Pressure mounted on police to find the predator hiding among them. And then, a break came. A woman who escaped Hansen's clutches would finally give the authorities the key they desperately needed. It was the break the authorities had been desperately waiting for, a glimmer of hope amid the darkness that had shrouded Anchorage for years. In the icy grip of Alaska's wilderness, a woman had survived Robert Hansen's hunt. Her escape would not only save her life, but would ultimately unravel the carefully constructed mask of the butcher-baker. The woman, a young sex worker who had encountered Hansen in a dimly lit bar, remembered the man as polite, unassuming, exactly the kind of person no one would suspect of harboring such evil. But when he lured her into his car and whisked her away in his plane, the reality became terrifyingly clear. She was not going for a casual drive, nor was it a simple transaction. She was stepping into a nightmare meticulously planned by a man who had spent years perfecting the art of hunting humans. Hansen landed in the wilderness, as he always did, choosing a remote area where no one would hear her screams or find her tracks. Once on the ground, he tied her up. His calm, steady demeanor giving no hint of the violence he was about to unleash. Then, in a cruel twist, he released her, allowing her a fleeting head start, a chance to run, to believe she might escape. The snow crunched under her feet, the bitter wind cutting through her thin clothing, and her lungs burned as she sprinted through the trees, every shadow and rustle a potential death sentence. Behind her, Hansen followed with cold precision, the sound of a rifle moving through the underbrush, the snap of branches, the inevitability of the chase. It was all part of his ritual. But this time the woman refused to give up. She ran farther, weaving through the dense forest, over frozen streams, and across moss-covered rocks. Her terror sharpened her senses, and her survival instincts, honed by fear and desperation, kicked in fully. She noticed details that would later prove crucial. The direction of his pursuit, the pattern of the terrain, and even the distinct hum of his plane from earlier. Hours seemed like days, and each moment was a test of endurance and willpower. She pushed herself beyond exhaustion, knowing that giving in meant certain death. And then, miraculously, she reached a small clearing where hunters were working nearby. Collapsing into their line of sight, she screamed, her voice raw and desperate, finally reaching someone who could help. The hunters, startled but quick to react, called the authorities, giving the police their first clear description of the man behind the nightmare. Her account was chillingly detailed. She described Hansen's physical appearance, his mannerisms, and his calm, methodical way of stalking his prey. More importantly, she provided information no one else could have known: details about the plane, the locations where he dropped victims, and the types of weapons he carried. The police, previously frustrated by dead ends and vanishing evidence, finally had a living witness to connect the dots. The escape of this single woman changed everything. Investigators now had a focal point, a way to piece together Hansen's decade-long campaign of terror. Maps could be drawn, flight patterns reconstructed, and victims identified through the connections she revealed. For the first time, the hunter could be hunted. Hansen's invincibility, built over years of careful planning and manipulation, was beginning to crumble. For the survivor, the trauma was profound. She had faced death and stared into the eyes of a man who found pleasure in cruelty. Yet her courage and determination didn't just save her life. It set in motion the chain of events that would finally bring Robert Hansen to justice. Through her testimony, the authorities could see the full scope of his depravity. The trophies, the shallow graves, the maps, all pieces of a puzzle that had remained hidden in plain sight for far too long. This escape wasn't just a moment of survival. It was a turning point. The fear that had gripped Anchorage, the whispers of vanished women, the frustration of police searching for answers, all of it began to converge. Robert Hansen, his carefully constructed world of duality, the baker by day and hunter by night, was on the verge of collapse. And the man who had eluded justice for so long was about to face the consequences of the darkness he had nurtured for decades. The butcher-baker-esque game was over, and the evidence was about to speak louder than his mask of normalcy ever could. The investigation that had seemed stalled for years finally gained momentum. Thanks to the courageous survivor, the authorities now had a description, a pattern, and most importantly, a sense of urgency. Robert Hansen, the seemingly ordinary baker who had evaded suspicion for so long, was about to be unmasked. But even with this breakthrough, no one could have anticipated the meticulous web Hansen had woven, or the shocking calm with which he would ultimately confront the law. The police acted quickly. Using the survivor's testimony, they traced his movements, his vehicle, and even the remote airstrips he had used to transport victims into the wilderness. For the first time, Anchorage law enforcement began to see the full scale of Hansen's crimes. It wasn't just a missing persons case anymore. It was the work of a serial predator who had terrorized the city for more than a decade. When authorities obtained a search warrant, what they found inside Hansen's home was both horrifying and methodical. In his bedroom, hidden behind locked doors and carefully concealed compartments, they discovered a collection of small, seemingly innocent items. Rings, necklaces, and other personal trinkets. Each was a trophy taken from a victim, a grotesque record of his hunts. More chilling were the maps of Alaska's wilderness, meticulously marked with the locations of shallow graves. These weren't sketches made in a fit of rage. They were deliberate, organized, and methodical. The blueprints of a killer who had spent years perfecting his craft. The arrest itself was almost anticlimactic. Hansen was calm, almost polite, as the police took him into custody. There was no violent struggle, no desperate flight. He appeared unnervingly composed, a man who had always known he was in control until now. But the real shock came during the interrogation. With an eerie steadiness, Hansen admitted to his crimes, detailing the hunts, the kidnappings, and the murders. Explained with chilling matter-of-factness how he had selected women, how he transported them, and how he released them into the wilderness only to track them down like prey. His confession was as methodical as his crimes. Hansen spoke without hesitation, recounting his decades of terror as if describing a hobby or a job well done. There was no remorse, only a clinical recounting of acts that had left dozens of families grieving. For investigators, hearing the confession was both validating and horrifying. The abstract fears and suspicions they had harbored for years were finally confirmed in brutal detail. Yet even as the pieces fell into place, the enormity of Hansen's depravity was almost impossible to comprehend. He had managed to live a double life for years, a devoted father, a polite neighbor, a well-liked baker, while simultaneously committing acts of extreme cruelty in the wilderness. Every detail he revealed underscored how ordinary someone could appear while harboring unimaginable darkness. The chilling lesson was clear. Monsters can hide in plain sight. The confession also provided the authorities with the tools they needed to locate more of Hansen's victims. Using his maps, they found additional graves, uncovering the full extent of his killing spree. Each discovery was a grim confirmation of his obsession, his control, and his methodical approach. Investigators were struck by the precision with which he executed his crimes, the cold calculation behind every step, and the terrifying patience he exhibited over the years. By the time Hansen's confession was complete, the city of Anchorage began to grasp the scale of the nightmare they had unknowingly lived alongside. Families, victims, friends, and law enforcement alike were left to process the horrifying truth. The friendly baker who had smiled in the neighborhood, handed out bread, and gone about his ordinary life had been orchestrating a reign of terror in the wilderness for more than a decade. The butcher-baker's capture marked the end of a decade-long hunt. But it also marked the beginning of a chilling legacy, one that would forever serve as a reminder of how evil can hide behind the most ordinary faces. Hansen would face justice, but the scars he left on his victims, their families, and the city of Anchorage would linger far longer than any prison sentence could contain. After his arrest and chilling confession, Robert Hansen's fate was sealed. But the road to justice was still long, and the city of Anchorage braced itself for the public reckoning of one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. The courtroom would soon become the stage on which decades of terror, fear, and grief were laid bare, and the world would see the full extent of the butcher-baker's crimes. The trial began amid a media frenzy. Reporters from across the country descended on Anchorage, eager to document the story of the man who had hunted women in Alaska as wilderness-like animals. Families of victims sat in court, faces etched with pain and anticipation, while the city collectively held its breath, waiting to hear the details of Hansen's horrific spree. Every testimony, every piece of evidence, painted a picture of a man whose evil had been meticulously calculated and methodically executed. Survivors' testimonies were perhaps the most haunting. Their accounts brought Hansen's actions to life in a way that no physical evidence could. They described the fear, the chase, and the terror of being pursued through the unforgiving Alaskan wilderness. Each story underscored the same brutal truth. Hansen had derived pleasure from control, from the front, and from the vulnerability of his victims. His trophies, the maps, and the shallow graves were all corroborated, leaving little room for doubt about his guilt. During the proceedings, Hansen himself remained eerily composed. He did not plead for sympathy, nor did he attempt to justify his actions. Instead, he answered questions with the same clinical precision he had displayed throughout his life. Psychologists later noted that his demeanor during the trial reflected a chilling detachment, a man who viewed human life through the lens of a hunter cataloging prey, rather than through empathy or remorse. The jury had little choice. The evidence was overwhelming, and the scale of Hansen's crimes left no room for leniency. When the verdict came, it sent a powerful message. Even the most cunning predators, those who hide behind ordinary masks, could not escape justice forever. Hansen was sentenced to 461 years in prison, a symbolic reflection of the staggering number of victims and the severity of his actions. The sentence ensured that he would spend the remainder of his life behind bars, removed from the world he had terrorized for so long. Even in prison, Hansen's story continued to captivate and horrify. He remained unrepentant, yet his case became a critical reference point for law enforcement, criminologists, and psychologists studying serial killers. His life demonstrated the terrifying potential for duality in human behavior, how someone could live as a neighbor, a father, a baker, while simultaneously committing acts of unspeakable cruelty. Robert Hansen died in prison in 2014, largely forgotten by the public, but never by the families of his victims. His legacy is not just a record of death and horror, but also a chilling lesson about the fragility of safety, the deceptive nature of appearances, and the dangers of underestimating those who hide their darkness behind ordinary facades. The story of the butcher baker continues to echo through Alaska's frozen forests, through the history books, and through the lessons learned by investigators who vowed never to let a predator like him slip through the cracks again. It serves as a stark reminder that evil often lurks in the most unexpected places, and that vigilance, courage, and the voice of survivors are crucial in shining light on the darkest corners of humanity. As we close this chapter, we are left to reflect on the duality of man, the ordinary and the monstrous, the friendly baker and the ruthless hunter. Robert Hansen. Crimes are a testament to the fact that monsters can live among us, hidden in plain sight, until fate, courage, and determination bring them to justice.